I can see a solid rocket booster has broken away from Shuttle Challenger. That's what you're looking at in the middle of your screen.
73 seconds. That's all it took for one of the most watched launches in history to turn into one of the most haunting moments ever broadcast live. The disaster was witnessed by millions on television, but what the world saw from their screens was just one part of the story. In the final seconds before the signal was lost, words were spoken inside the cockpit that would not be fully understood for years. Reports were released, investigations were held, and NASA gave the public answers. But some of the most disturbing details of this tragedy were buried deep inside transcripts, technical notes, and testimony few people ever read. Now, decades later, new attention is being drawn to the men who were speaking to the crew that morning and to what they heard in the seconds after the shuttle was already gone. The tragedy of the Challenger crew. By January 1986, most Americans had stopped caring about space launches. It sounds strange to say now, but it was true. When the Space Shuttle program started 5 years earlier, NASA promised something new and exciting. Unlike the Apollo missions to the moon, which happened every now and then and stopped the whole country, the shuttle would fly all the time. It would carry satellites, run experiments, and make space travel as normal as catching a plane. But that promise backfired. The more launches happened, the less people paid attention. TV networks stopped showing them live because nobody watched anymore. A launch that would have made headlines a decade earlier now barely got mentioned on the evening news. The year 1986 was supposed to fix that. NASA planned 15 missions, the most ever, but none of that mattered if people didn't care. NASA needed to remind everyone why space was important. They needed to show that the shuttle wasn't just for pilots and scientists. The spacecraft picked for this mission was Challenger, an aircraft that was never supposed to fly. At first, she was just a test model. Engineers bolted her to machines and shook her, heated her up, cooled her down, and tried to break her. They wanted to see how much punishment a shuttle could take. She was a lab experiment, not a real spaceship. But NASA had money problems. Fixing up another shuttle would cost too much. So in 1979, they decided to turn the test model into the real thing. Workers spent years carefully rebuilding her. When they finished, Challenger was actually better than the other shuttles. She weighed more than 1,000 pounds less than Columbia, which meant she could carry heavier loads. By January 1986, Challenger had flown 9 times without any major problems. The tragic mission that would end in the Challenger carried 7 people, carefully selected by NASA. They weren't just astronauts, they were a picture of America. Francis Dick Scobie was in charge. He had flown before and knew what he was doing. Michael J. Smith was the pilot, a Navy man from North Carolina on his very first trip to space. Ronald E. McNair was a physicist, one of the first Black Americans picked to be an astronaut. Ellison S. Onizuka was the first American of Asian descent to fly in space. Judith Resnick had already been to space once before. Gregory Jarvis worked for a company called Hughes Aircraft and was flying to run experiments for them. And then there was Christa McAuliffe. In 1984, NASA came up with an idea to pick a normal classroom teacher and send her into space so she could teach lessons from orbit, and kids all over America would watch. It would prove that space wasn't just for the few, but for everyone. More than 11,000 teachers applied. They came from everywhere, every state, and every grade. But only one could go. Christa McAuliffe was selected, and immediately NASA announced her name. She became famous overnight. Her being on board changed everything. Schools planned special lessons around her flight. Families got ready to watch together. For the first time in years, America was finally paying attention to space launches. The launch got pushed back a few times. First, there were technical problems. Then the weather turned bad. Cold air moved into Florida, dropping temperatures into the low 20s overnight. Ice formed on the launch pad, covering everything in a thick frozen layer. No shuttle had ever launched in weather this cold. The people who made the rocket boosters got worried. They knew something the public didn't. The booster rockets were made in sections, and rubber rings sealed the gaps between them. In cold weather, that rubber got stiff. It couldn't flex and seal the way it needed to. Engineers warned that launching in such cold weather could be a disaster. Their warnings were talked about, but in the end, they were ignored. On the morning of January 28, 1986, ice still covered parts of the launch tower, but the 7 astronauts climbed aboard Challenger anyway. At 11:38 a.m., the countdown hit 0. The engines lit up, the rocket boosters fired, and Challenger lifted off the ground and climbed toward the sky. For more than a minute, everything looked fine. Then, 73 seconds after launch, the world watched the space shuttle break apart in midair. What the cameras caught on film would be replayed for decades. But inside Mission Control in Houston, the men communicating with the crew had no idea what had just happened. They weren't watching television. They were watching their screens. And what they saw, what they heard, and what they said in the moments after the disaster have remained mostly hidden until now. The first sign of trouble came just fractions of a second after liftoff. Cameras set up to record the launch later showed something disturbing. Less than a second into the flight, a puff of gray smoke shot out from the side of the right rocket booster. That smoke meant the rubber O-rings had already failed. Hot gas was leaking through a gap that should have been sealed tight. The disaster started in the very first second of the flight, even as the crew waved to the cameras below. For nearly a minute, the leak stayed hidden. The shuttle kept climbing. The crew kept communicating. At 58 seconds, a small flame flickered to life on the side of the same booster. It grew quickly, stretching into a long plume of fire that pointed straight back at the giant fuel tank holding millions of pounds of liquid hydrogen and oxygen. At 68 seconds, Commander Scobie's voice came through the radio one last time. His words were calm, professional, and utterly normal. "Go at throttle up," he said. It meant they were increasing speed as planned. At 73 seconds, the flame burned through the wall of the external fuel tank, and the tank collapsed. Liquid hydrogen and oxygen mixed and ignited instantly. The shuttle was moving faster than the speed of sound, and the force of the explosion tore it apart. The crew cabin, the part where the 7 astronauts sat, broke away from the fireball and kept climbing for a moment before starting its long fall toward the Atlantic Ocean. In Houston, 2 men sat in a room not far from Mission Control. They were the voices of the flight, the ones talking to the public and to the crew, and they had no idea any of this had happened. Steve Nesbitt worked as the public affairs officer. He was a former newspaper reporter from Texas who had joined NASA in 1981. His job was to describe the launch to the public, to tell people watching at home what was happening. He sat in a small room with a microphone and a stack of papers and a computer screen showing data from the spacecraft. Beside him sat Richard Covey. Covey was an astronaut, and he had the most important job of all that morning. He was the capsule communicator, the only person in Mission Control allowed to speak directly to the crew. Surprisingly, when Challenger broke apart 800 miles away, Steve Nesbitt and Richard Covey had no idea. The first sign of trouble was the silence. The radio went quiet, and the data stopped flowing. Steve Nesbitt stared at his screens and saw readings that made no sense. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know what. At 11:39 a.m., less than a minute after the shuttle disappeared from the sky, he leaned into his microphone and spoke words that would be remembered forever. Flight controllers are looking very carefully at the situation, obviously a major malfunction. Beside him, Richard Covey did what he had been trained to do. He picked up his microphone and started calling the crew. Over and over, he spoke their names, waiting for a response that would never come. In a house somewhere in Florida, an off-duty NASA spokesman named Terry White watched television. He had seen the launch before, dozens of times. But when he saw the puff of smoke that morning, he later said, "A chill ran down through me. I knew it was going to be a catastrophic failure." He was right. And in Houston, inside Mission Control, the men whose job it was to talk to the crew were about to find out just how right he was. The aftermath and investigation. Immediately after the disaster was confirmed, Jay Green, the flight director inside Mission Control, made a decision that would preserve the only evidence they had. He ordered every data console frozen. No one could touch anything. No one could leave the room. The doors were locked. Every screen, every readout, and every piece of paper became evidence for whatever investigation would follow. In the Public Affairs Office, Steve Nesbitt had gone silent, and almost immediately the phone started ringing. Newsrooms across the country wanted answers. What happened? Was the crew okay? And was this as bad as it looked? The officers picked up the phones and had nothing to say because they didn't know anything for sure. At the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, the scene was even worse. Families had gathered on the grandstands to watch the launch. Krista McAuliffe's parents and schoolchildren were there. They had waved and cheered when the shuttle lifted off. Now, NASA escorts appeared and led them to private rooms where they watched the footage of the explosion over and over. In Washington, President Reagan faced a difficult choice. He was supposed to give the State of the Union address that night. It was one of the most important speeches a president makes. But he canceled it, and at 5 o'clock that evening, he spoke from the Oval Office instead. His words would become some of the most remembered in American history. "We will never forget them," he said, "nor the last time we saw them this morning as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God." The search for answers started immediately. The Coast Guard began picking up debris floating in the ocean, anything that hadn't sunk yet. It didn't take long to confirm the word worst. The shuttle had broken completely apart. There was no chance of survivors, but most of the wreckage was underwater. Over the next several months, more than 6,000 people would join the recovery effort. Navy divers, Coast Guard crews, even civilian contractors with special equipment. They searched 480 square miles of ocean floor. At the peak, 13 ships were out there at once, crisscrossing the water in grid patterns, looking for anything that might explain what went wrong. On March 7th, nearly 6 weeks after the disaster, they found what mattered most: the crew compartment. It lay in 100 feet of water, about 17 miles offshore. The images showed a window frame, part of the forward structure, and a seat cushion. Everything else was scattered across the bottom. Divers went down to recover what they could. They worked in difficult conditions, limited time on the bottom, and heavy currents pushing against them. They loaded pieces into burlap bags and baskets. Nets would have let small fragments slip through, and they couldn't afford to lose anything. By late March, they had recovered about 75% of the cabin. On April 13th, they finally found the evidence that would solve the mystery. A 2-ton section of the right solid rocket booster lay in 560 feet of water, 35 miles from Cape Canaveral. When they brought it up and examined it, the scorching was clear. Hot gas had burned through the O-rings exactly where engineers had warned it might. It was the smoking gun, physical proof of what had gone wrong. President Reagan appointed a commission to investigate. It was called the Rogers Commission, named after the man leading it, former Secretary of State William Rogers. The members included some of the most respected names in America: Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon; Sally Ride, the first American woman in space; and Richard Feynman, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who didn't care about politics and just wanted to know the truth. Unlike previous NASA investigations, which happened behind closed doors, these hearings were televised. The whole country watched engineers testify against their own managers. They watched experts argue about rubber and cold weather and decisions made in the middle of the night. On February 11th, Richard Feynman did something simple that would expose the truth. He asked for a glass of ice water, and he dropped a piece of O-ring material into it. After a while, he took it out and squeezed it, but the rubber stayed compressed and didn't spring back. The demonstration lasted maybe a minute, but it ended the debate. The O-rings had failed because it was cold, but the investigation uncovered more. The O-ring problem had been known since 1977. Engineers had seen damage on flights as early as 1981. They had warned about it, written reports about it, and begged someone to pay attention. But NASA's safety reporting system was so broken that warnings got buried. The pressure to keep launching, to meet schedules, and to prove the shuttle was safe and routine had drowned out the people trying to stop a disaster. By April, the physical cause of the disaster was clear, but one question remained unanswered. It was the question no one wanted to ask out loud, but everyone thought about in private. What happened to the crew? Were they alive on the way down? Did they know what was happening? NASA held that information back, and in July, a doctor named Joseph Kerwin would finally give the answer. What the Kerwin Report uncovered. 6 months after Challenger fell from the sky, NASA released a document that answered the question no one wanted to ask. What happened to the crew on the way down? The man tasked with finding the truth was Dr. Joseph Kerwin, and he was not just any physician. He was a NASA astronaut who had spent 28 days in space aboard Skylab in 1973. He understood spaceflight from the inside. At the time of the disaster, he served as Director of Life Sciences at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. If anyone could piece together what happened in those final minutes, it was him. Kerwin led a team of engineers, scientists, and pathologists. The Armed Forces Institute of Pathology sent experts to help examine the wreckage. Their job was to examine the recovered crew compartment and determine, if possible, what happened to the 7 people inside between the moment Challenger broke apart, the moment their cabin hit the ocean, 2 minutes and 45 seconds later. On July 28, 1986, exactly 6 months after the disaster, Rear Admiral Richard Truly released Kerwin's findings to the public. The report came as a letter from Kerwin to Truly, not a thick document full of technical jargon, but a concise summary of what the evidence showed. NASA issued a press release alongside it, thanking the people who had spent months recovering the crew module from the ocean floor and examining every piece of evidence. Kerwin's opening line told the public what they needed to know right away. The findings were inconclusive. The impact of the crew compartment with the ocean was so violent that it erased most of the evidence. The cabin hit the water at roughly 207 miles per hour. The force of that impact was estimated at 200 Gs. To put that in perspective, a trained fighter pilot can black out at around 9 Gs. 200 Gs meant the cabin and everything inside it was destroyed on contact. Whatever happened before that moment, the crash made it nearly impossible to prove. But Kerwin's team found enough evidence to answer some questions. And those answers were disturbing. Challenger broke apart at roughly 48,000 feet. The crew compartment separated from the rest of the shuttle, tearing away from the cargo bay, the nose cone, and the fuel tanks. For a moment, it continued upward on its own momentum, reaching a peak altitude of about 65,000 feet roughly 25 seconds after the explosion. Then it began falling back to Earth. Engineers used ground photographs and data from onboard instruments to calculate what forces the crew experienced during those first seconds. 2 separate assessments produced similar results. The largest acceleration pulse on the crew module was between 12 and 20 Gs on the vertical axis. Within 2 seconds, those forces dropped below 4 Gs. Kerwin's medical analysis was direct. These accelerations were survivable. The probability of major injury to the crew was low. This contradicted what most people assumed. The public had watched the explosion on television and believed the crew died instantly. However, the evidence suggested otherwise. The cabin remained intact. The forces on it, while violent, were not strong enough to kill. The crew likely survived the breakup of the shuttle. Then came evidence that made the situation even more haunting. Each crew member wore a helmet equipped with something called a personal egress air pack. These were emergency breathing devices designed for ground emergencies only. They provided about 6 minutes of breathable air by filtering the air inside the cabin, not by supplying oxygen from a tank. They had to be activated manually. Each astronaut had to reach up and turn theirs on. 4 helmets were recovered from the wreckage, and 3 of them showed evidence of having been activated. The one that had not been activated belonged to Commander Scobie. One of the activated units belonged to pilot Michael Smith. The other 2 could not be linked to specific crew members. though some sources suggest they belong to Ellison Onizuka and Judith Resnick. This meant at least 3 crew members survived the initial breakup. They were conscious and must have been aware enough to recognize something was wrong with the air, and they had the physical ability to reach up and activate their emergency breathing packs. Kerwin noted that the helmet activation could have been an instinctive response to unexpected loss of cabin pressure, but he added something important. The evidence showed the air packs were not activated due to water impact. They were activated in flight while the cabin was falling through the sky. The next question was whether the crew remained conscious during that fall. At 65,000 feet, without cabin pressure, a human would lose consciousness within seconds. The air pack supplied breathable air, but if the cabin itself had lost pressure, that air would not have been enough to keep them awake. The pressure inside a space cabin at that altitude is what keeps blood and oxygen flowing normally. Lose that pressure, and even with air to breathe, the body cannot function. Kerwin's team examined the crew module for signs of pressure loss. They looked at the windows, the floors, the walls, every seal and joint. They analyzed glass fragments chemically and microscopically, but they found nothing conclusive. The impact damage was too severe. Some evidence suggested the cabin might have stayed pressurized. Items in lockers showed patterns of damage that might have occurred due to decompression, but experiments with similar items produced inconsistent results. Kerwin's final conclusion was careful and measured. The crew possibly, but not certainly, lost consciousness in the seconds following the breakup due to loss of cabin pressure. But the report left one thing clear. The crew did not die in the explosion. They survived the breakup. They rode the falling cabin for 2 minutes and 45 seconds. 3 of them activated their emergency air supplies, and then whatever happened before that moment was swallowed by the sea. After NASA released Kerwin's report, they also made something else public. The last words of 7 astronauts, recorded on the cockpit voice recorder and preserved through the fall. Among those words was a final transmission from pilot Michael Smith in the chaos after the breakup, and what he said would raise questions that still have not been fully answered. The final words of the Challenger crew. When the transcript was released by NASA, reporters and families and the American public read through it line by line, searching for something, a warning or a cry, some sign that the crew knew what was coming. What they found instead was something almost more unsettling. Ordinary conversation, professional calm, routine checklists, and then silence. The conversation captured on that tape was exactly what you would expect from 7 professionals doing their jobs. They discussed acceleration forces as the shuttle climbed. They checked cabin pressure readings. They talked through roll maneuvers as the vehicle steered itself toward orbit. At one point, mission specialist Ellison Onizuka noticed a piece of paper floating in the cabin and made a joke about it. It was the kind of moment that happens on every flight, a small bit of humor in the middle of serious work. The final transmissions came in the last seconds before the end. At 68 seconds after launch, Commander Scobie's voice came through clearly. "Go at throttle up." It was a routine acknowledgement, confirming they were increasing engine power as planned. 3 seconds later, at 73 seconds, pilot Michael Smith spoke 2 syllables that would be analyzed for decades. Oh, that was it. The last human voice ever recorded from Challenger. The transcript ended abruptly. There were no screams, no panicked calls to mission control, and no long goodbyes to families watching below. The tape proved something important. The crew had no warning. There were no alarms sounding in the cockpit or flashing lights signaling danger. The O-rings had failed at liftoff, but that failure was hidden from view, buried in the joint of a rocket booster miles away from where the crew sat. They flew through the first 73 seconds, believing everything was fine. Smith's uh-oh was surprise, not fear. What happened after the tape stopped recording is not captured anywhere. The voice recorder went dead when the shuttle broke apart, but the air pack evidence told the rest of the story. 3 crew members activated their emergency air supplies after the breakup. That means they were alive and conscious, and they were aware enough to reach up and turn on their breathing packs during the 2 minutes and 45 seconds the cabin spent falling through the sky. The "uh-oh" has been debated for nearly 4 decades. Some analysts believe Smith saw something on his instruments, a sudden drop in pressure, or an unexpected change in the vehicle's flight path. Others think he looked out the window at exactly the wrong moment and caught a glimpse of the flame growing on the side of the booster. A few have even suggested he felt the shuttle yawing, turning in a direction it should not have turned, and his brain registered the anomaly just before the vehicle came apart. What matters is the timing. 3 seconds after Scobie's last transmission, Smith spoke. 1 second later, at 74 seconds, the data stopped. He had maybe a second, maybe 2, between realizing something was wrong and the moment the vehicle disintegrated around him. Not enough time to say more or to warn anyone. Just enough time for 2 syllables that would haunt everyone who read them. NASA emphasized something when they released the transcript. They wanted the public to understand that there were no untoward comments from the crew prior to the loss of data. That was their careful way of saying the crew did not know they were going to die. They did not spend their final moments terrified, screaming, and begging for help. They were professionals doing their job until the very second their world came apart. But the transcript only tells part of the story. It ends at 73 seconds. What happened in the 2 minutes and 45 seconds after that, during the fall from 65,000 feet down to the ocean, is not recorded anywhere. No microphone captured whatever noise might have been heard as the cabin tumbled through the sky. But what do you think really happened in those final minutes? Do you believe the crew was conscious during the fall? Drop your answers in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.